First and foremost, I just want to thank Circle for the invitation to come down and visit you and share a little bit with you about a relatively new research area of mine related to second language digital social reading. I also want to acknowledge the University of Arizona and Arizona State University for funding this very unique symposium. And before I get started, I also want to say for the record, describing Steve Thorne and his presentation style as a hurricane is right on. To extend it further, I'm just a mere cloud. I was going to say whimsical cloud, but maybe I should say a puffy cloud that resides over northern Utah. So I just hope that you take something away from my talk here today. As you can see, again, I'm talking, sharing with you some research related to digital social reading. And in preparing, can you guys hear me? Do I have to lean in? Okay. In preparing for my talk today, I came across an interesting initiative online called the Pages Project. And I've taken a screenshot and put it up here on this first slide. And in reading about it, this is essentially an initiative that was started by a man who had inherited some books from a grandfather who had passed away and discovered some very rich, detailed annotations in the margins and kind of connected him to his family member and provided some insight in terms of the thought processes that his family member was having at the time when he or she was reading certain aspects of the text. And I thought that this was a nice, sort of a nice way to kind of talk a little bit about what digital social reading is all about. And as you'll see, essentially it boils down to having students annotate texts with digital annotation tools. So what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a roadmap here, what I'll be doing as far as my talk here. First and foremost, I want to sort of situate social reading within sort of a broader context of the human experience, and then argue a little bit about why this is important in a second language learning and teaching context. Secondly, I want to demo some of the technologies involved, again, the digital annotation tools that allow for this collaborative or social experience in L2 contexts. And then talk a little bit about a research project that is forthcoming and a couple of others related to this, and share some initial findings and just sort of provide you with an overview of what we're looking at. And finally, along the way, talk about what are some of the pedagogical aspects or considerations that we need to take into that we need to think about when doing this sort of thing in a second language classroom context. So number one, when we think about social reading, when we start reading about it, and particularly in the context of digital social reading, I just wanted to sort of start by taking a step back and thinking about this notion of social reading. This has been around for a while, several centuries, as depicted in this painting of Molière reading in a French literary salon, again in the 17th century, a place where folks would get together, gather, someone would read, and there would be some conversation regarding what was being shared in that context. If any of you know anything about Spanish history, or if you teach Spanish, you very well should know about the Spanish tertulias, which were essentially literary kind of gatherings that happened in various locations. This is Café Gijón, which is still around in Madrid, and again, a sort of a site for literary sort of talks and engaging each other about text. Fast forward to today, and the ways in which we see social reading, again, manifests itself in public readings, whether it's an author reading from his or her book, a poetry slam in a bar, to extending it to nighttime bedtime routines, at least in my house, and a toddler somewhat listening, reading his own book, to then extending this to a digital space. And then obviously, as we've heard, that we are immersed in the digital age, if you will. And so there are plenty of online spaces where there's text and there's some reading that's happening and some interactions that are happening. In this case, this is New York Times. One of their features is the editors provide this thread of discussion on the right. They go through and they pick, obviously, the more commented parts of the comments that are most that are more popular, I guess, the readers' picks. To other socially sort of networked or mediated environments, Facebook had a year of the books last year. They chose a popular book each month, and they had Q&A with the author at some point during the month, and they had obviously threaded discussion or ongoing discussions throughout the month with the readers. To websites that provide a social space to meet other folks who are reading the same book, to create a virtual bookshelf, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea of reading and interacting with text, particularly in the digital age, again, I think it's becoming, as was noted before, it's part of what being a human being is, I think, in many respects. Why have I become interested in this? There are a couple of different reasons. The first one is, from my background and my training as a language program director, I've sort of cited this continued separation of some of the learning and teaching goals in many foreign language programs across the U.S. with respect to lower level courses focusing on quote-unquote language, and upper or advanced levels of advanced courses focusing on content. Excuse me. And this bifurcation, again, sort of leads to oftentimes learners not critically engaging with text from early on. And I think that looking at reading can somehow, and as we'll see, social reading can mitigate this divide between language and literature goals in a foreign language program. Over the last few years, too, I've also been dabbling and reading about and still learning about multiliteracies and a pedagogy of multiliteracies, which again offers, as Kern suggests here, a way to reconcile this teaching of communication with textual analysis. So that's actually has informed my thinking about this. And coincidentally, the last time I was in Tucson, I was attending a multiliteracies workshop provided by Circle. So thanks again, Circle, for offering some valuable professional development opportunities. Why L2DL reading? This should be no surprise. I'm kind of speaking to the choir here with respect to the omnipresence of technology in our lives. The number of learners in our classrooms that essentially carry out their lives in both an academic and social lives through the digital tools that they have. It's radically changing, obviously, what we define as literacy. So how we go about accessing, producing, and interpreting texts is changing. And with this multiliteracies approach, with this idea of sort of understanding and learning language through text, we have these other literacies that come along with it: computer literacy, information literacy, and media literacy as well. So what do we mean when we say L2DL social reading? What exactly is that? Blythe has a very succinct definition that I like. He calls it the act of sharing one's thoughts about a text with the help of tools such as social media networks and collaborative annotation. And again, digital annotation tools are essentially sort of the method or the way in which we engage with each other around text. And it allows learners to sort of develop learning strategies, reading strategies with respect to manipulating the text and understanding the text. And so I thought I'd just take a couple of seconds here to show you some of the standard features that many of these digital annotation tools have, in case you haven't seen them before. This is a screenshot from a tool called Classroom Salon, produced by Carnegie Mellon several years ago, and is free, an open educational resource. But this is a sort of a standard feature, and this is called a heat map. So as you can see, parts of the text are highlighted. This is where learners are highlighting it, and that then creates a threaded discussion on the right-hand side by which learners are leaving comments, and they're replying to each other, et cetera. And as different parts of the text are highlighted by more students, the darker the color. So those three red spots, that's where more students were essentially interested in commenting on, or different words. And so visually, from an instructor perspective, you can sort of see right away what are some of the parts of the text in which the learners are really interested in or having problems with. The same thing for the students, obviously. This is a screenshot from Akama, which is another OER created by Carl Blythe and a colleague at the University of Texas, Austin. And as you can see with this feature, there's tagging that happens where Students are asked to tag certain, in this case, pre-verbal tense markers in French. And so instructors can go in and set these tags up and have learners essentially sort of looking at the linguistic features of the text of the digitized text. Another screenshot from Akama, which is related to a forthcoming project that I have with some colleagues at Utah State, where we looked at this in a Chinese language learning course. And this tool allows, which is called a word cloud, obviously. And so as you digitize text in the Akama, it automatically creates the word cloud and sort of provides maybe some sort of advanced organizer or kind of a pre-writing reading activity could be created around that to sort of have learners visually see right away what are some of the key terms that are part of this text. In terms of researching second language digital social reading, to date, the majority of the research has been carried out in L1 contexts. Meaning that the learners are annotating text and commenting using their native language or their first language. In L2 contexts, the majority of it has been carried out in EFL and ESL learning environments. The one study that has looked at second language learning or digital social reading in a second language environment focuses on 2 French undergraduate courses by Blythe in 2014. And so he describes some of the strategies that are used by learners with respect to digitizing and making sense of the text. Evidence of interpretive strategies and looking at issues related to French vocabulary, as well as students reflecting on cultural differences between sort of their own cultural background and the values that they have versus what is found in the text or when the texts were written, sort of reflecting the cultural context in which the text was written. However, in both of these cases, these case studies, and particularly in one, the students were allowed to use their L1 to comment about some of the French aspects of the text or the text in French. The other one, they could use either L1 or L2. So this got me thinking that we need some research in this area to really sort of understand what is going on when we present learners with this type of tool and when they actually go about annotating text. So myself and a graduate student, I want to acknowledge his role in this, Fred Poole, have a forthcoming article in Language Learning and Technology. And again, I just want to give you a sort of brief overview of what we tried to do and what we're investigating. So. What we did was we went into a undergraduate second language, obviously Spanish, poetry course, which met weekly, 1 night a week, 2.5 hours. And it's a small scale exploratory study, so only 15 students. But they went in and we went in and for a month they were reading their poems, 18 poems, via a digital annotation tool called Highlighter. And I'll show you the interface for that in a minute. What we asked them to do was to require or annotate, make an original sort of comment on each of the poems that were assigned per week. And they were usually assigned 4 to 5 poems per week. And we gave them 3 days to do that, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. By Friday midnight, we gave them then the task on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, before they met on Tuesday, to then respond to original comment from other students. To avoid having them all sort of go in and do these tasks the night before, which a lot of our students like to do. So that's why we sort of staggered it throughout the course of the week to sort of to get a little bit more interaction going. And I should say that these comments were made in lieu of a mini analysis assignment that they were typically doing throughout the course of the semester each week. The instructor would give them some guidance in terms of what they needed to look for and what they should comment on when they were reading the print-based texts. We carried out qualitative and quantitative analyses of students' annotations across all poems. We also looked at their answers from survey distributed to the entire class, and also looked at the interview responses from instructor and some focal students. Here's the interface for Highlighter. Again, we have the text on the right. Students are annotating it. It's creating this sort of threaded discussion over there on the left. So one of the primary goals of this research was to provide some empirical evidence about what affordance an affordance might look like in this particular environment. And so I briefly just want to talk a little bit about what an ecological perspective of L2 learning is. So from this point of view, again, the learner is immersed in an environment full of potential meanings, and it's sort of through the interactions and the activity of the learner by which they gradually sort of interact with the environment. The metaphor of ecology, again, captures the interconnectedness of psychological, social, and environmental process of SLA. So, as Van Leer says, and as we've heard, Steve talked about this as well, sort of there are a number of learner and context-based factors that sort of work together. And it's through that sort of that interaction, the organism in the environment by which affordances arise. And again, we wanted to see exactly what does an affordance look like. So what we did with our data was to delineate 3 different types of affordances that we found in the student annotations. First one was what we call the linguistic affordance. So any discursive mood that, again, explicitly looked at language or linguistic information. So structures, grammatical structures, lexical meaning, something that was focused on understanding grammar or language. A literary affordance was defined as discursive moods that express insights related to textual analysis. So this could be a learner's interpretation of a particular part of the text, whenever they would use or make reference to a particular rhetorical device that they had been learning in this poetry class, that would sort of be coded as a type of literary affordance. A social affordance was a discursive mood that reflected some sort of or expressed some sort of agreement or disagreement. Expressed someone's opinions about maybe what someone else wrote, etc. So this is kind of a quick overview, gives you a snapshot in terms of what we found over the course of the 4-week project. In all, between the initial comments made and the replies, 562 sort of annotations were produced. The majority of them were, as I put here, literary and social in nature, and very few related to language or linguistic, were deemed as linguistic affordances. We have a little trend line here in terms of sort of seeing how those played out across the 18 texts with, at this point, no real understanding in terms of why that is, but we're digging into the data to look at some other aspects related to why some of these different types of affordances, particularly literary and social, were so present. So here I wanted to briefly provide some examples in the discourse here in terms of what a literary affordance is in this case. This is a student who commented on a word, I, in Spanish. It was in the title of a poem. And he talks a little bit about and references a rhetorical device called an aphora that the author employs straight up at the beginning of the poem, again in the title. And he goes on and talks about what I means for him and how he's interpreting it. Each time that I is repeated, it makes me think about a cry, a shout of agony. Each thing that it describes is something that picks at the heart and makes it feel such a strong pain that it makes it yell, oh, or I. It is as if each thing that his lover does or every memory that he has makes him feel pain that makes him scream in agony. And another response by a student. A social affordance down there where he says, me gusta tu idea, I like your idea. This is again sort of expressing sort of agreement with, or alike in this case, in terms of the other learner's interpretation, if you will. And at the bottom here, with many of these digital annotation tools, you can bring in other sources to sort of back up your argument. In this case, the learner went outside of the tool, found some information online at another, and posted a link here within his comment. And a sample linguistic affordance is pretty straight up, and in terms of what that looks like, there's the words corazón amortajado, which means shrouded heart, And so there's sort of a literal translation here on what the halo means. To shroud, this image is interesting regarding how the sun penetrates his closed heart, etc. So we illustrate this in the study a bit more and talk a little bit more about each of those, but I wanted to give a glimpse of what we did there from the theoretical perspective. Regarding the applied nature of this, we wanted to really understand what are some of the challenges or constraints that learners encounter when presented with a digital text and a particular, in this case, an assignment in terms of annotating text. And there are a couple of main points here, 3 main points that we saw in the data. One of them we didn't really expect, but in hindsight, it's crystal clear why they said this. The first one was making one's comment distinct from other students, to avoid being perceived by fellow students and the instructor as someone who was not prepared or was not able to adequately interpret the literary text. So the idea of mandating students to have a novel sort of annotation, comment about a poem that sometimes is only 3 or 4 stanzas long was difficult for them to do, but they didn't want to appear lazy, and so they talked about this as being a challenge to try to come up with a sort of a novel comment. The digital nature of the collaborative reading experience sometimes meant that students were reading other students' comments, and these comments weren't really helpful to the one student who needed a comment, so if that makes any sense. From one of the interviews of the focal students, she said, whenever I was on a highlighter, I would see people's comments as I was reading the poem, which, normally I wouldn't see. So I feel like sometimes that did kind of influence my ideas about the poem, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, it kind of prevented me from forming my own ideas about it because I was like being influenced by what other people were saying. So that's one of the risks in terms of trying to do this in a classroom context. The third sort of challenge expressed by students was, again, sort of grasping the whole idea of digital text and not having access to those annotations when they went into the physical classroom on that next Tuesday to then engage in whole class discussion about the meaning of the text. And so not everybody had a laptop, and so this idea of trying to become accustomed to this new way of annotating text was a challenge for some students. What are the primary benefits and challenges of doing L2 social reading from a sort of instructor's perspective? The first one that the instructor expressed, a literature professor, said that there were some social benefits, and the main one was it established this sense of community in the classroom that wasn't always apparent when meeting in class. Pedagogical benefits, he said that he had a better understanding of his students, identify the fact that students X, Y, and Z actually read and actually had really great ideas, even though they hadn't been sharing them all semester, was sort of something that he realized was a benefit, and necessarily didn't see that again up until this point when we did this study. Performance benefits, again, he commented about the fact that students didn't just sort of write and have a response, sort of a knee-jerk response that you might maybe find in in-class discussions about it, but it actually had them, slow down and think about what they were willing to write, and because everybody else was seeing what they were writing. So there might have been some peer pressure involved with that as well, but also just sort of more of a contemplative way about understanding the text. The main drawback for the instructor was, again, this idea of not having students have their notes or their annotations that they normally would physically write on the print in order to facilitate in-class discussion. And at one point, I think the second week, he required or wanted us to actually print off the annotations and give them and distribute them to the class to have this sort of this discussion in class. Some final thoughts here. Last slide. From my perspective, I think, as I started out saying, I think that digital social reading can and does unite language and literature instructional goals. Again, I think this is doable in a lower level class, changing the tasks perhaps, but extending this all the way through the end of the course sequence. It also encourages meta reading. So not only reading the text, but also forcing students to, not maybe forcing is the wrong word, but allowing students the opportunity to read others' comments meant that they, related to number 3 here, they actually carried out a more, or closer reading of the text, and the instructor commented on the quality of their reading and their responses in class afterwards. Finally, I think that this is a technique from a pedagogical perspective that can be used in a variety of second language courses, face-to-face, hybrid, and online. And that's all I have. Thank you.